I've lived in Willow Creek Estates long enough to know that it's not just any neighborhood. It's not just a community, it's a model of perfection, one that's maintained by a strict set of rules set by the HOA. And at the center of all the rules, all the controls, is Margaret Dunham. Willow Creek Estates is a quiet painting, where lawns are trimmed to no more than 2 inches, fences are spotless white, and house paint colors are chosen from a limited list of HOAs. Anything that deviates from these standards is quickly corrected. A warning, an email reminder, and if necessary, a fine will land in your inbox the next morning. She's not just the HOA president, she's the invisible ruler of the neighborhood. An email from Margaret can cause a family to repaint the entire front of their house just because the color is a little darker than the code. A warning from the HOA can force a resident to replace a row of trees they've planted for 10 years because they don't fit in with the architectural style of the neighborhood. No one wants to go against the HOA, and no one wants to go against Margaret. But among the myriad of rules, there's one that stands out the most: no kites. No kites are allowed in the neighborhood, not in parks, not in front or backyards. It's not just a ban, it's an absolute ban. No one really knows why. Some say a kite got tangled in a power line years ago and knocked out the power to the neighborhood. Others say that Margaret was hit on the head by a kite as a child, and since then she's been determined not to let any kites fly on her property. Whatever the real reason, the residents know for sure kites don't belong in Willow Creek Estates. No one ever questions the rule, because everyone has grown accustomed to obeying it without question. Kids can slide in the park, but no balls. Adults can plant trees in front of their houses, but they have to be HOA approved. And when it comes to things that can fly in the sky, everyone knows that's a no-no. HOA control is more than just a piece of paper. It's ingrained in the way residents live. When something is banned, it's no longer an option. People don't just avoid doing it, they don't even think about it. I never really cared much about the rule. I don't have kids who fly kites, nor do I have a special love for kites. To me, HOAs are more of a nuisance than an obsession. But then something started to catch my eye. Why ban kites? If it's really for safety reasons, why isn't there a similar kite ordinance in every neighborhood? If it's for aesthetics, why are Christmas lights allowed to be displayed every winter, but kites, which only briefly appear in the sky, banned? I realized that the ban was more than just a rule. It was a symbol of absolute control. Kites aren't like house paint or fence style. They can't be fixed to the perfect frame the HOA has in mind. Once a kite is up in the air, it's out of control. It can fly high, it can drift far, it can crash anywhere. And that makes Margaret uneasy. Margaret doesn't ban kites because they're dangerous or unsightly. She bans kites because she can't control them. And then one day a kite shows up. A kite soaring into the sky over Willow Creek Estates. It's the moment that changes everything and the moment that drives Margaret crazy. The sky was a clear, deep blue that day, as if nothing had ever dared to disturb the perfection of Willow Creek Estates. The sun was shining brightly, and a gentle breeze rustled the white picket fences, rustling the trees, which were so meticulously trimmed that they barely had a leaf to spare. Everything was as calm as it could be, as if the entire neighborhood had been designed to maintain a state of absolute stillness, where any irregularity was eliminated before it had a chance to appear. I was standing on the porch, finishing my afternoon coffee, when something that didn't belong in the neighborhood's perfection caught my eye. At first, I wasn't sure if I was seeing things, because it was something that shouldn't have been there. A kite. It was coming from the small park in the middle of the neighborhood, which the HOA regularly sent out reminders about as a community space to be preserved in peace. At first, it was just a speck, swaying gently in the wind. But then, within seconds, it soared upward, its outlines gradually becoming clearer. It was a kite, a colorful shape, shimmering in the sunlight, fluttering softly like a living creature in midair. Its wings were wide open, stretching out in overlapping patterns of blue, purple, and orange, strangely beautiful, a beauty that defied the odds in a place where everything was bound by rigid patterns. I wasn't the only one who saw it. Windows opened in the surrounding houses. Eyes began to turn skyward. A few children gasped. Some adults looked confused, but no one said anything. No one really understood what was going on. A kite flew in Willow Creek Estates. I knew no one in the neighborhood would dare do that intentionally. No adult wanted to confront the HOA, and the kids were too used to the rules to challenge it. I glanced around, trying to figure out who was challenging the order, and then I saw him. Jake. He was about 8 years old, standing on the park lawn, his hands clutching the string of his kite, his face lit up with a huge smile. Jake didn't seem like a rebel, just a kid enjoying a wonderful moment that should have been the most normal thing in the world. A boy flying a kite. But here in Willow Creek Estates, it wasn't normal. It was an event, an unacceptable thing. I saw Jake's parents standing nearby, their faces tense as if they'd just realized their terrible mistake. Maybe they'd bought the kite for him without remembering the rule, or maybe it was a gift from his grandfather, who didn't live here and didn't understand the rigors of HOAs. Whatever the reason, they realized their mistake too late. The winds picked up, and the kite continued to rise. It was no longer just a small object floating in the air. It had become the center of attention, an unconscious statement in the empty sky of Willow Creek Estates. And then, a moment of silence, not because no one wanted to say anything, but because everyone knew what was coming next. I knew without looking that Margaret Dunham had noticed. Surely somewhere out of a window or just down the street she had seen the kite flying in the otherwise empty sky, and that meant things were about to get bad. I put down my coffee and crossed my arms, feeling a little excited for some reason. For the first time in years, something Margaret couldn't control had happened in Willow Creek Estates. I knew what was coming before it even started. The air around the park was tense, as if something invisible had been broken. Open windows were slammed shut, and a few residents walking by sped up their pace as if they didn't want to be there right now. Everyone knew that there was one unbreakable rule in Willow Creek Estates. You didn't want to mess with Margaret Dunham, and then she was there. I heard the click of her heels on the pavement before I saw her. Fast, decisive, furious. When I turned, Margaret was charging from the HOA building, her perfect cream dress billowing with every step. Her face was tight, her eyes sharp as if she had seen a terrible crime. I could only imagine the terror inside her, the fear that something was floating in the sky that she couldn't control. She stopped abruptly in the middle of the park, taking less than a second to locate her target. "Jake! You! Pull him down!" Her voice was sharp, echoing through the empty space. Jake's parents, now completely pale, rushed toward their son, so frightened that they looked like they had just committed a serious crime. I saw them stammer something, perhaps an apology, perhaps an attempt at an explanation, but all excuses fell on deaf ears. When Mrs. Margaret gave the order, Jake, of course, had no idea what was happening. He was still clutching the kite string, his eyes shining with the joy only an 8-year-old could feel when he saw his kite soaring through the sky. Little did he know that, in this place, joy could be taken away in an instant. But then the wind changed direction. A sudden gust of wind swept through the park, pulling the kite string taut, sending it jerking forward. Jake staggered, his small hands trying to hold onto the string, but the wind was stronger than he was. In an instant, the string slipped from Jake's hands. The butterfly kite soared higher, out of reach, drifting toward the rooftops of Willow Creek Estates. I heard a few gasps from the people watching from a distance. Jake's parents froze. Margaret's eyes widened as if she couldn't believe what was happening. The kite hadn't fallen, it was still flying. That was the moment I realized this situation had spiraled out of control. If Jake had simply pulled the kite down when asked, if his parents had quickly reeled it in and apologized, maybe it would have ended there. The HOA would have sent a warning email, maybe a ridiculous fine, but eventually things would have returned to normal. But no, the wind wouldn't let that happen. The kite no longer belonged to Jake. It belonged to the wind, to the sky, to something bigger than the mundane rules of the HOA. It drifted farther, a symbol suspended in midair, slow, defiant. I glanced at Margaret. She wasn't just angry anymore, she was mad, and I knew this moment was just the beginning of a much bigger storm. I don't know exactly what Margaret did after the kite spun out of control, but I imagine she stormed back to the HOA office in a rage she'd never known before. And sure enough, the next morning, the kite crackdown began. As soon as I stepped outside my house, I saw the first signs of HOA wrath. A large, bright red notice was posted on a bulletin board at the entrance to the community. I walked closer and saw the bold lettering at the top. HOA emergency announcement, no kite flying. Below that was a long list of prohibitions, explaining why kite flying was dangerous, a threat to the safety of residents, and a serious violation of Willow Creek Estates regulations. The bottom line stated a $500 fine for anyone who violated the rules, with a warning that repeat offenses could result in more serious legal action. I wasn't surprised. This was how Margaret operated. First, the threat. She had always believed that if you threatened hard enough, people would be scared into compliance. But what surprised me wasn't the notice. It was the residents' reaction. No one pulled the sheet down. No one mumbled a word of protest. They just brushed it off, as if it were a natural part of life here. And then, the HOA upped its game. The warning emails began rolling in. Every household got the same message, the same as the bulletin board notice, but this time with a more personal tone. It wasn't just a blanket warning, but a reminder that the HOA's eyes were on every. But that wasn't all. 2 HOA security guards showed up at the park that afternoon. They weren't wearing police uniforms, but their presence sent a clear message. They stood at the edge of the park, arms crossed, eyes scanning the lawns, as if waiting to see who would dare violate the ban. They did nothing. They didn't need to. Their very presence was a threat. The already quiet park became eerily quiet. The children playing nearby kept their distance from the clearing where Jake's kite had flown the day before. No one wanted to be the next to attract the HOA's wrath. But there was one thing I noticed immediately. The atmosphere was not one of acceptance, it was one of suffocation. Discontent was simmering like a small fire hidden under the ashes, waiting for a wind strong enough to ignite it. I glanced around the neighborhood, seeing other residents watching all this. Some read the notices silently, others just glanced at the warning emails on their phones before sighing and shaking their heads. But in their eyes, I saw something the HOA didn't see. They weren't afraid. They were just waiting, because no matter how many notices are posted, how many threatening emails are sent, or how many security guards are deployed, no one can control the wind. I thought the HOA's crackdown would work. I thought the warning emails, the $500 fine, and the security guards stationed at the park would be enough to smother any rebellious thoughts before they could even form. I was wrong. Instead of making people bow their heads in obedience, the ban had the opposite effect. Maybe it was the frustration that had built up. Maybe it was the way the HOA had always controlled everything, from the color of the house paint to the number of bushes in the front yard, that had worn people down. Or maybe people were just tired of being banned from something as small and harmless as flying a kite. I don't know who first challenged the ban, but a week after the notice was posted, I saw it, another kite. This time, it wasn't a tiny butterfly that rose from the park, but a larger, more powerful kite, shaped like an eagle with its wings spread. It didn't fly low like Jake's, but soared high, challenging the winds above as if it were more than a toy. It were a statement. I stood on my porch, watching it float in the clear blue sky, and I wasn't the only one. Windows were open, neighbors stopped on their walks, children pointed, adults smiled, small but meaningful smiles. Everyone knew what it meant. Everyone knew someone had dared to rebel. And then the unthinkable happened. Not just one, but many kites began to appear. At first, just one or two a day, flying for a few brief minutes and then coming down before the HOA could intervene. But then, within 2 weeks, the skies above Willow Creek Estates were no longer empty. Kites appeared in all shapes, colors, and sizes. There were sharks, dragons, superheroes. Some flew high, some hovered low, and some tilted in the strong wind. The park, which had been tightly controlled, became a hub for an underground movement, the kite movement. But perhaps what made me laugh the most was when people started designing kites with more ironic meanings. One afternoon, as I was strolling through the park, I saw a kite shaped like Margaret. Not a pretty or delicate kite. No. It was a satirical caricature with a scowl, furrowed brows, and a pursed mouth, as if about to shout some kind of command. It slowly circled the sky above the HOA building, as if looking down at the very woman who had banned it. I could hardly believe my eyes, but what surprised me even more was that no one stopped it. Margaret must have seen it. The security guards must have reported it. But the storm was beyond their control, because when a kite with Margaret's face flew, within days, it was no longer the only one. I started seeing kites with the word freedom on them, kites with the slogan, "The wind doesn't belong to HOA," and someone even designed a giant kite with an angry woman holding a $500 fine notice. No matter what HOA tried to do, people wouldn't stop. They weren't flying kites because it was a game anymore. They were flying kites because they could. They were flying kites to prove that no one could control the sky. I didn't think Margaret would give up easily. Someone who had spent her life trying to control things would never accept the fact that something was out of her reach. And just as I predicted, HOA didn't back down. They fought back. Within a week of the first kite taunting, a new notice arrived in every resident's mailbox. This time the paper was no longer bright red, but a cool gray, with bold letters that took on an even more stern tone. Because of the severity of the repeated offenses, the Willow Creek Estates Board of Directors had decided to increase the fine for anyone who deliberately violated the kite-flying ordinance. Effective immediately, the fine would be $1,000 per violation. I remember staring at that number for a long time. $1,000, a ridiculous number for a ridiculous ordinance. But I knew it was more than just a fine. It was a message. The HOA wanted to send a final warning, stop or else. But the residents didn't stop. The kites kept flying. I began to realize that fines no longer scared anyone. People knew the HOA couldn't fine everyone. They couldn't fine the whole neighborhood. And then Margaret did what she always did when her authority was challenged. She called the police. One afternoon, as I was leaving my house, I saw 2 police cars parked in front of the HOA building. Neighbors had gathered around, standing in small groups, whispering. I could see Margaret talking to a police officer on the lawn, her hands flailing, her face red with anger. I didn't hear the entire conversation, but I could guess what she was saying. I could imagine her sharp voice saying, These people are breaking the rules. We have proof. They're not following the neighborhood rules." But the police's reaction was not what she expected. I saw the officer shake his head, his shoulders slack, his face showing no sign of urgency. The conversation lasted less than 10 minutes, and then they left, leaving Margaret standing frozen in the middle of the lawn. No one was arrested. No one was stopped. Because, simply put, flying a kite is not a crime. But Margaret was not giving up. A day later, another notice appeared in every resident's mailbox. This time it was not just about a fine, but also a legal threat. The HOA threatened to sue anyone who continued to fly a kite for violating the community's bylaws. I'm not sure who hired the attorney first, but the following week a response from a law firm appeared on the HOA's website. The HOA's bylaws do not have the legal authority to punish residents for behavior that does not violate any laws. If the HOA attempts to pursue legal action, we are prepared to defend our clients' rights in court. With a single brief statement, the HOA was defeated. No residents were sued, no one had to go to court, and the kites kept flying. I can't imagine what Margaret must have felt when she read the lawyer's letter, because for her this wasn't just a battle about rules, it was a battle about power. And now, she had lost on all fronts. But what I do know is this: from that moment on, the HOA lost control of the neighborhood. I don't know exactly when people stopped worrying about the HOA. Maybe it was after the police left without doing anything. Or maybe it was after the lawyer's letter made Margaret's threats irrelevant. But I do know one thing for sure. The moment the HOA lost control, Willow Creek Estates changed. The neighborhood skies were no longer empty. Every day, whenever there was a breeze, I saw kites flying. At first, people were still cautious, flying kites discreetly in backyards or in parks during off-peak hours. But within weeks, the fear had disappeared. No one was hiding anymore. Kites were strung on sidewalks, brightly colored kites were rising from rooftops, and the park lawns were now the center of an unprecedented neighborhood event. Kite Day. I don't know who came up with the idea, but it was inevitable. If the HOA was ever going to control everything, the best way to fight them was to turn taboo into tradition. And that's exactly what happened. On the first Sunday of every month, residents gather in the park, which until a few weeks ago had been controlled by HOA security guards, to fly kites openly. No one fears being fined, no one fears being watched, because now the HOA can't do anything. Adults bring their children. Young families bring picnic blankets. Parents laugh as their children run across the lawn, pulling kites of all shapes and sizes, from the simple to the elaborate. At first, I just stand on the sideline, still unfamiliar with the freedom of the scene. But then, without realizing it, I'm drawn in. I see an elderly couple flying a heart-shaped kite, a group of young people competing to see who can get it the highest, and children laughing as they run across the lawn, their kites shimmering in the sunlight. No one mentions the HOA anymore. No one pays any attention to Margaret. For the first time, Willow Creek Estates looks more like a place to live than a place to simply exist. But perhaps most surprisingly, the kite craze didn't stop with the residents. Soon word of the movement spread. People began to flock from other neighborhoods. Some had lived here before the rules became so strict. Others had just heard about the HOA and wanted to see the change for themselves. And soon, kites were no longer an act of protest. They became a symbol of freedom. The kites grew bigger, more beautiful, more elaborate. One family designed a giant kite shaped like an eagle spreading its wings. A group of local artists created a kite shaped like a sun with bright rays. There was even a kite shaped like an HOA building with tangled strings symbolizing the unreasonable regulations it once imposed on the neighborhood. I couldn't help but laugh as I watched it soar into the sky, hovering over the heads of those who had once lived in fear of meaningless rules. And as I looked up at the sky, now filled with color, I realized something important. This was no longer a story about kites. This was a story about a community that had learned to stand up, that had reclaimed its freedom after years of oppression. The kite festival went on, month after month, and the HOA, no one cared anymore. I don't know the exact moment that Margaret realized she had lost. Maybe it was when the police left without doing anything. Maybe it was when the lawyer's letter made all the HOA's threats seem ridiculous. Or maybe it was when, for the first time in years, she looked up at the sky and saw something she couldn't control. The kites continued to fly, despite all attempts to suppress them. The monthly kite festival became an indelible tradition, and when the event was reported in the local press, it was officially etched into the history of Willow Creek Estates. The HOA was no longer the absolute ruling power. It was now a relic of an era that no one wanted to return to. Those who had feared the HOA began to challenge them in various ways. People planted illegal flowers in front of their homes, left their bicycles on the sidewalks without putting them away, hung Christmas lights past January 1, as if testing the waters to see what else the HOA could do. But there was no response from Margaret. I began to notice her less visible, no longer patrolling the neighborhood with the same watchful eye she used to. The HOA office, which had been her central hub, was now closed most of the time. On the first kite festival after she left, I walked out to the park and looked up at the colorful sky. The kites were still flying, as bright as ever. People were laughing, children were running, no one was worried about warning letters or watchful eyes anymore. And then I saw it. One particular kite among dozens of others. It was Margaret. There was no doubt that it was a caricature of the woman who had ruled the neighborhood with fear. Her face was grim, her eyes were sharp, her mouth was pressed tightly together, as if she were about to issue another ban. But now she could do nothing. Margaret was gone, but her image was still here, floating in the freedom she had tried to control. And I couldn't help but laugh. Not in mockery, not in glee, but at the irony of it all. Someone who had tried to control every little detail of this neighborhood had ended up tied to the one thing she couldn't control: the wind. I stood there looking up at the sky as the kites continued to fly, as the children continued to laugh, as Willow Creek Estates finally became a place where people could truly live, not just exist within rigid rules. And then I turned and walked away, knowing that from now on, the sky would forever belong to the kites.